Critical Role's Exandria is a vibrant setting with so many fascinating characters, locations, and cultures. But have you ever wondered that most important question, how big is it? With multiple maps giving us scales, surely this can't be too hard to figure out, right? If we're going to find the size, our first step is starting off with these maps. Taldore, the setting of Campaign 1 and the Heroes of Vox Machina, has a full map illustrated by Andy Law. Wildmount, the setting of Campaign 2 and the Mighty Nine, has a map by Devin Rue, who also did the region maps that were handed out during the campaign. These two continents are pretty close together, so much so that there were talks of building a bridge to connect them. With these positions, we can see them combined in this map, also by Andy Law. But lovely as this is, this only shows us two continents and the islands of the Shattered Teeth, with the barest hints of Sealra and Marquette, not really a full world map. We do have one canonical map of all the known lands of Exandria. You can find it in episode 103 of Campaign 1. Hold on, let's zoom in. Zoom in. See? World map. This does give us a good sense of the relative locations and the general shapes, but it isn't quite what we're looking for. So instead, let's turn to some fan-made maps based on this outline and the other canon, regional, and continental maps that have shown up so far. This map is by West Haberlein, who deserves endless amounts of praise for all the work they do in the Critical Role fandom. Taldore and Wildmount are based on the official maps, while Marquette and Isilra are based on Nico Van Halla's fan-made maps, alongside Devin Rue's region maps for the Odaran Wilds and Hellcatch Valley. Now, these maps come with a legend. Each square is 200 miles across, giving us a width of around 5,300 miles. If we put this up against a map of the Earth, we see that Exandria is much, much smaller. Less than 1/4 the size, smaller than our moon. Tiny. Even the larger continents are the size of Europe or Australia, not coming anywhere close to the Americas or Asia. While this may be all the known lands, that doesn't have to mean it's all of Exandria. After all, while Isocross may be close to the North Pole, we don't have a southern pole at all, nor any sense of what may be west of Isilra and east of Wildmount. So, if we don't know the full map, how can we figure out the size? Well, I'm sure someone could do the map, with the time of day as they teleport across the world, but I think the easier option is to look at the climate patterns of Exandria, as these are often very tied to latitude. To explain what I mean, let's go back to looking at this map of Earth, since that's our only real reference point for livable planets. The most obvious climate zones that we can see are the polar regions, the areas consistently covered by glaciers and ice. That gives us Antarctica, everywhere below 60 degrees south, and in the north, Greenland at 60 degrees as well, alongside slightly higher into northern Canada and the upper areas of Europe and Russia. This 60 degrees cutoff isn't accidental. The global atmosphere of Earth has 3 pairs of cells. The Hadley cell, where air rises from the equator to sink back down at 30 degrees north, the Ferrel cell, where air rises at 60 degrees to sink at 30, and the polar cell, where air rises at 60 degrees to sink at the poles. That means that 60 degree cutoff is where you see the cold air trapped, circulating from there to the poles and back. Our other visual region is our desert. The most obvious is the Sahara, spreading out into the Middle East. This is centered around that 30 degree mark, going from 15 degrees to 45 degrees. The sinking air from the Hadley and Ferrel cells lead to dry bands around 30 degrees, which can also be seen in the southern hemisphere, in the southwest US, and Central Asian steppes. While we see strong deserts here, latitude isn't the only factor in forming a desert. Ocean circulation and mountains can also heavily impact rain patterns. These rainfall pattern variations determines what areas become desert versus forested or more plains regions like savannas. Finally, in between our deserts and polar bands, we see our wetter regions, where rising air causes larger amounts of rainfall. In the tropics, we have rainforests and jungles, while around 45 degrees, we have temperate regions, your standard European climate. In the US, the impacts of the Gulf Stream on the eastern coast gives us a more temperate climate, even in the drier bands. Given this background, we can roughly identify where the equator, 30 degrees latitude, and 60 degrees latitude points are on our map of Exandria. Obviously, this assumes heavily that the climate patterns are similar to Earth, when we know Exandria has to be significantly smaller, on top of the vast magical interferences impacting normal climate patterns. Still, most fantasy worlds stay close to our own, and I think we can see the same patterns reflected here. Our only truly polar regions can be found in Isocross and the Graying Wildlands, the only areas we know to have glaciers. There isn't anything seen to the south, but this sets up our northern boundary. We'll add in northern Taldore for reference, but this is likely colder than the surrounding regions due to the frigid depths, bringing cooler water south, as opposed to a strict mark of latitude. Similarly, we don't have the official maps of Exandria, and the coloration is more a pretty reasonable guess. Our only major deserts are in Marquette, but not every dry region will be so clearly a desert. The most obvious by coloration alone is the wastes of Jorhas, a dry Badlands region. But looking at the distribution of forests, we see more savanna-like areas in central Taldore and the Mero Valley. There is a lot of rainforest to be found with the Rifinus jungles, and most of the Menagerie Coast. Although similar to northern Taldore, it's likely ocean circulation, bringing warm water along the side to expand the region, similar to the Gulf Stream in the eastern United States. We also have rainforests in Marquette to the north and the south. While there is lore evidence to suggest that the desert is not natural and the whole of Marquette should be tropical rainforest and therefore equatorial, looking at our map, it feels more natural for Exandria and southern Marquette to be temperate rainforests instead of tropical. Compare with the rainforests you see in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. For completionist sake, we'll also add in northern Taldore and Wildmount as our temperate regions. This lines up fairly close to the patterns we see on Earth. Our desert bands would be around this point, giving us an equator directly between them, cutting through southern Taldore and just south of the bottom tip of Wildmount. Based on that, our 60 degrees polar mark would be about 3 squares north, which lines up well with Wildmount and Exandria, but suggests a much colder southern edge of Marquette than what we've seen. Although keep in mind, our map of Marquette isn't fully official. On the small end, I suggest we see our main degrees of latitude here, but on the larger end, they'd be about here, with the 60 degrees south mark just slightly off the edge of the map. For our smaller map, the top is the North Pole, but we get to add a bit more distance to the southern hemisphere. Assuming our distance east to west is exactly twice that north to south, that gives us this map, with a circumference of 8,100 miles, 1/3 the size of Earth, larger than our moon and between the size of 2 of Jupiter's moons, Callisto and Io. Or, for our slightly larger version, we get this, with 9,700 miles circumference, just larger than Mercury, but about 3/4 the size of Mars. Despite what some people may lead you to believe, Exandria isn't flat. So let's take this map and look at it on a proper globe. Here we can see our beautiful map, now with an ocean taking up about half the visible space. Or, for our slightly larger version, we have an ocean that takes up about half the globe, so much so that you can't see either Wildmount or Exandria and just pure open ocean. This gives us perhaps enough space for a missing continent, but there's something not quite right about these globes. If we look at the North Pole, then we see that isocross has become incredibly thin and compressed, not the shape that we see when looking at our normal map. While this isn't as dramatic on our larger globe, there's still some distortion. This is because the map we're using isn't quite what the program wants us to be. You see, our maps of Exandria are based on this 200 by 200 mile grid. There's no real map projection that works like this. The closest comparison is to an equirectangular projection, like Plate Curie, what I used to start off comparing Exandria and Earth. Here, we see that each square is equal to 15 degrees latitude and 15 degrees longitude. But while latitude is consistent in size, the distance between degrees of longitude varies, getting larger and larger the closer you get to the poles. We can visualize this with Tissot's indicatrix of deformation. While the height of the circle is consistent, the width changes, so that it's about twice as long at 60 degrees as the equator and infinitely long at the poles. Because our maps of Exandria don't have this stretching, instead we see isocross being smushed. This could be fine if we assume that 200 miles is only accurate at the equator, but more realistically, we'd need to try to distort our map to match Plate Curie. To try and replicate the stretch, I calculated how long each degree of longitude was for the lines. 69 miles at the equator becomes 68 at 8 degrees, meaning I stretched the first section 101%, ending up with this beautiful monstrosity. Unfortunately, the method I used to stretch is more exaggerated at the edge than the center, so the Menagerie Coast isn't as exaggerated as Blateshore. Because of this, I stretched Exandria separately from Taldore and Wildmount, and then adjusted the location to try and keep the distances as close as possible. Looking at the globe with our new stretched map, we now see that isocross looks closer to what we were seeing, but instead of being just next to Wildmount, it now stretches across like almost a bridge to Exandria. Our ocean feels a lot closer to the Pacific in size. Instead of taking up almost half the globe, we get to see the edges of Wildmount and Exandria when looking at it. Our slightly larger globe isn't as dramatic a difference. Because isocross is closer to the 60-degree mark than the poles, it wasn't as distorted, but we still see it stretch out to the more expected shape. Our ocean is again larger than Pacific, but still not so big we can't see at least the edges of Wildmount and Exandria when looking at it. This is still plenty of space for some undiscovered lands, but it's not unreasonable for it to be just completely empty ocean. So there you have it. With canon maps of Marquette and Asilra, we may get a better sense, but Exandria is about the size of Mercury or the larger gas giant moons. Smaller than Earth, but not unreasonably small for a planet. And I can already hear people commenting, but what about the gravity? Assuming that Exandria has the same density as Earth, 5.5 grams per cubic centimeter, a little math gives us gravity of 3.2 on the small end and 3.8 on the large end, about 1/3 the gravity on Earth, but double that of the Moon, about where the gravity of Mars is. To put that in perspective, the average standing jump is about 1.5 feet. On the Moon, you could jump a full 12 feet, while on Mars, or Exandria, you could jump about 5 feet. As someone who does not mess with jumping rules in Dungeons & Dragons, that feels kind of exactly how I'd homebrew it, and I'm not gonna lie. We could also excuse this as just everyone grew up on Exandria, so they don't have other reference points and are adapted to this gravity, but that's a bit of a cop-out. We could also look at this from a different angle. If we instead assume that the gravity is the same as Earth, 9.81 meters per second squared, then we have densities of 17 on the small end and 14 on the large, about 3 times as dense as Earth, which is already the densest planet in our solar system. I am not a planetary geologist, but these aren't completely ridiculous numbers. The density of Earth's core is 13 grams per cubic centimeter, and there are quite a few denser metals. This could be an indication that Exandria is incredibly abundant in gold, or uranium, or that good old classic explanation, magic. I'm gonna go with magic. Who knows what the primordials have done to mess things up. That does it for this video. If you have any thoughts on these maps, whether you think Exandria is closer to the larger or smaller of the globes, and what exactly is out there in that massive ocean, let me know in the comments. And if Campaign 4 is set entirely in the mystical lost continent west of Asilra, sunken during the Calamity and now an underwater empire, well, you heard it here first.